the thing that Jung said in the Red Book, the wealth of the soul exists in images. So images, archetypes, symbols were felt by Jung, both Jung and Hillman, to be really central to understanding what they call the unconscious space, or which is called the Brahman or the consciousness in the Indian tradition. Jung also did not see the function of myth as merely connecting us, but also engaging to maintain a healthy psyche. And this is where I said the difference of the orientation towards psyche in Western traditions. He proposed that archetypes grab people and resonate with their own emotional and narrative life experiences. So this treats the suffering of the soul or the suffering of the body caused by the soul as a deep-seated state where reason does not permeate, but myth connects and restores wholeness. But he also says an important thing, and he says that, two things actually. He says that creativity is a way of doing this, but we need to have creative capabilities. So we need to be able to dance or paint or do something in order to engage with the space. And the second thing he says is we have to be predisposed to the mythical frameworks. And I think this presents a challenge for us in the West, where we don't actually have these living archetypal frameworks to draw on. And James Hillman also made an impassioned plea for recognizing the significance of the pathological states of the psyche as pathways to the soul through archetypal modalities. So in Indian practices, engagement with archetypes is a deliberate and structured process with a long tradition. And I observe that in the West, a lot of these traditions are not living. It has been lost. So therefore, you can see that Jung had to develop his own method in the Red Book, in his own work, which was a process of self-experimentation and spontaneous fantasy to develop models of reflecting, wherein he entered into a dialogue with the mythical characters or archetypes that surfaced in his fantasies. He also said that the learning that one got from this process was not idiosyncratic, but you know, I must say I find that difficult if one wasn't as knowledgeable and as practiced in this method, and as widely read as Jung, because Jung did read a lot of the other archetypal traditions, including some of the Indian work. I just sort of ponder as to how this can happen. How could you prevent it from being idiosyncratic or very sort of fantasy-based? Can we go to the next one, Jeff? Archetypes are also symbols of emotional states. And in the Indian tradition, every philosophical pathway, whether it's in yoga or Vedanta or Tantra, the emotions are a big challenge. And there's always ways in which we have to deal with the emotions. So for example, in yoga and in Vedanta, you've got pratyahara, which is like withdrawing the senses. In Tantra, which is, for me, one of the really beautiful traditions in dealing with the body and emotions, you actually give a real significance to those drives in us, like the sexual drive, the emotional drive, and they are kind of embraced in rituals rather than withdrawing from them. Tantra invites you to actually embrace them through very structured ritualistic modes. Now, dance is one of them. There's like puja or ritual. There are mandalas, and I think Richard beautifully explained that in your talk here on Tantra. There are mandala, which are visual representations. There is song. So Tantra really invites an engagement with those drives and emotions. And again, you know, unfortunately in the West, I think as Richard mentioned as well, it has been largely misinterpreted to be a sort of indulgence in these spaces, rather than a very disciplined subsuming and embracing of those spaces towards a very specific goal, and that is subsuming the selfhood to enter the Brahman space. And the other thing also is that, and Jung says the same thing, is when you enter into all these modalities, you need a really good guide, somebody who knows, who's experienced, who knows what it's like and who can guide you, and when you engage with people in the tantric area, all participants are very clear what they're doing and what their role is and what the aim of the process is. So it wasn't meant to be a sort of, what shall I say, a casual or an experimental approach. The Natya Shastra, which is the text on Indian theatre theory, has a whole theory called the Navarasas, or the Rasa Theory, which is specifically about engaging with archetypes and emotions, or emotions through archetypes. This text, which is a text that I've kind of grown up with and know quite well, is given a divine source. So it is supposed to have come from Brahma and Shiva. So Brahma on the theoretical side and Shiva on the practice side. And it's got about 36 chapters and 6,000 verses. It is very tedious because obviously it's been written and compiled over a period of time. So there are lots of contradictions and repetitions and long lists and catalogs, and there's been numerous commentaries written on the Natya Shastra just to unpack it. But I had a teacher, my teacher in dance, Vempati Chinnasatyam, insisted on using the Natya Shastra as the source text. So we all had to put up with all the inconsistencies and make sense of it somehow. But the Navarasa, or the Rasa Theory in Natya Shastra, is a lot has been written about it, and there's, particularly in recent times, there's been a lot of interest among Indian academics and scholars on the Rasa Theory and consciousness and psychology and all of those things. So basically the Rasa Theory states that when you're performing, usually in archetypal modes, your job as a performer is to depict a particular rasa. So what is a rasa? Sometimes rasa is translated as an emotion, but it is actually a state rather than an emotion. So emotions are called bhavas, and so that could be things like what can I say, grief, anger, anger is still a rasa, or raudra, which is not really anger, but it's an anger-filled state. But so the feelings could be things like sadness, happiness, and those sort of things are called bhavas. And rasas are more complex states which bring together multiple bhavas, and therefore they are best represented by archetypes. Because they're too complicated to understand and split up into their individual components. So they're best understood as more archetypal and complex states. And so when you're a performer and you're performing in particular roles, you will enter into one or multiple rasa states, and you are supposed to be quite aware technically of what is the rasa state that you are trying to portray. What are the bhavas in that state? And what is the physicality associated with the bhavas? And if you're able to do that, you will then be able to convey that rasa with absolute integrity to people that are watching you, and also evoke the same rasa in them. And together, you kind of transcend, I really don't like that word, but I can't think of how else to translate it. But you transcend that particular rasa, and then ideally, you would enter into that state of being with the Brahman, or the Supreme Consciousness. So that was the duty of the performer, and as an audience member, you came prepared for it. So you didn't come just to watch entertainment, but you were very well aware of the expectations of this Rasa Theory, and so you would come usually to a temple where these performances were held. There were usually all-night performances, and you would come there to watch the various different archetypes. You would have some idea of what their particular raudra, what their particular rasas were, and so you kind of came prepared to engage and to also undergo this process. So you can see the challenge, which I'll come to later, that we face in times like now, where these forms are not performed in temples anymore, and they've moved to theaters. So the Western tradition, the Western theater tradition, is based on, of course, the classical Greek theater, where you had something that looks similar, like the cathartic process, but there are significant differences, because catharsis was about purging negative emotions. And it, to me anyway, as an observer and as someone who's dabbled a bit in Western works, it kind of stops pretty much at that purging. So there's purging of the negative emotions. It does use archetypal modes, because in the Greek tragedies in particular, you had these characters who were quite archetypal characters. But the cathartic process has a very different aim and a different engagement between the audience and the performers.